is a professor in the government program, and he is the current director of the Institute for Social Research at Sacramento State, as we like to call it, California State University at Sacramento.
By saying current, it makes it sound like, you know, at any moment I could be fired.
No, you're there for life. Next is Ed Nelson, who many of you know. Ed is an emeritus professor of sociology at Fresno State, and is also a past director of an institute for social research. And finally, Randy McIntosh, and Randy is now an emeritus professor of sociology, again at Sacramento State. And for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Ernie Cowles, an emeritus professor and previous director at the ISR. So, without further ado, we'll move into our panelist presentations. What I'd like to do, I think we have plenty of time. These are nice long sessions. But what I would like to do, if possible, is to hold the questions until all of the papers have been presented, because I think it helps the continuity, and also there may be ideas that generate or cross-generate across the different paper presentations. So if you would, as you're going along, just jot your questions down, and we'll make sure that we reserve plenty of time for discussion and questions after the papers. So we'll be starting, I think, with David, working our way down the presentations. I did not mention, David has a co-author who could not be here this morning, Matt Foy, who's a graduate research assistant, associate, whatever. I'm not sure what the title is right now, at the Institute for Social Research.
Great, thanks a lot. And as you can see, we're having technical difficulties. I'm trying to see if we can get the sizing correct here so you can see everything on the screen. Hopefully any minute we'll get that sorted out. Do you know?
I've been
looks like you're trying. It looks like that's going the right way.
Yeah, I've been trying.
Oh, there you go.
Like this. Okay.
Keep. Oh, okay.
That's as far as it goes.
That's as far as it goes.
It doesn't go very far.
Okay. Well, that'll be fine, I think.
Okay.
So, again, I'm David Barker from Sac State, and what I'm talking about today is an effort that we have been going through for a little while now to build a panel of survey respondents throughout California, and some of the travails that we've had with that process, and comparing the different sampling methods that we use to build that panel in terms of their efficiency, response rate, and representativeness. So again, the basic research questions are, if you're trying to set up an online panel that you're hoping is representative, what are the pros and cons of the different types of recruitment or sampling methodologies that you can use to build that panel? And also, what demographic characteristics tend to be overrepresented, underrepresented by panels? And the answer to that question we all actually probably already know, but there it is. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is first off talk a little bit about the California Speaks panel, right, which is this panel that we are building. The three different sampling methodologies that we've used to gather panelists to build that panel, and then compare them, like I said, in terms of response rates, attrition rates, and demographic representativeness. So first off, the Cal Speaks panel, I think everybody in here probably is well aware of the growing challenges that survey researchers face in the contemporary era. The CADI model, the computer-assisted telephone interviewing model, is increasingly difficult. You see all this stuff in the news all the time with regard to the challenges that political pollsters are facing in terms of, you know, we've got response rates now that average around 6%. About half the public doesn't have a landline phone anymore, and that's shrinking dramatically. And of course, there's demographic systematicness to that as well, with younger Americans being much less likely to have landline phones. Furthermore, everybody has a cell phone, but they all keep their area codes, right? I've got 5 people on my family plan, and I'm the only one with a 916 area code, even though we all live here, right? And so that makes stratification issues really difficult. So for a whole host of reasons, right, it's just really tough to collect survey data the traditional way. And so survey researchers across the country and across the world, indeed, are moving more to the online model to gather survey data. However, that, as we all know as well, has many of its own challenges. There's no comprehensive file or list from which to draw a sampling frame, right? So therefore, the traditional mode of probability sampling, where everybody in the population has a known non-zero probability of being sampled, is basically violated, right? And so for a long time, people would just use these, convenience samples, and you see those all over the place. People inviting you to take surveys online that are just convenience samples. The move over the course of the past several years has been to try to build a panel of respondents through methods that are at least quasi probability based, to try to then approximate a probability sample on this panel of respondents who have then agreed to take multiple surveys over time. And the big advantage, of course, is that it's incredibly less expensive to gather data this way. And there are all sorts of other advantages to collecting data online over the phone as well, namely reductions in acquiescence bias and social desirability bias, and some of the other things that you can do when somebody's taking a survey themselves on the screen in terms of remembering response options and stuff like that. So that's what people have been doing, and over the course of the past couple of years, you've seen tons of these pop up nationally. NORC now has their AmeriSpeak panel. Pew has I think it's the American Life panel or something like that. Gallup has one now, and so this is definitely the direction that the industry is headed. However, questions remain in terms of the nature of response that you're going to get and how representative those are of the population. So again, what we're trying to do as we build this is try out different things and see what seems to work best, because we're still in the infancy of our panel right now, and so we're in an experimental phase where we're figuring out what works, so we can then move forward in the most productive and most representative way. So the panel that we have built, our building, is around 3,000 respondents, or 3,000 panelists total, stratified across California. The idea is that we will distribute one survey to them, to a subsample, a randomized subsample of those panelists every 4 to 6 weeks. We offer $5 of an incentive for each completion. That panelists, every time they complete a survey, they get $5. Our panel is unique in that it is California focused, hence the name California Speaks. And so all these other ones that we've talked about, lots of them, like I said, have popped up. They're national, but ours is specific to California, and so we're trying to address issues that are specific to California. And we hope to provide new opportunities for state government and media, as well as our colleagues throughout the CSUs and other universities, to collect survey data in a way that's inexpensive and facilitates better research. All right, so as I said, there are 3 sampling methods that we've used, and what this actually says, you can't see it, is first sampling method, the caddy follow-up, right? And so what we did, one of the surveys that we collect at Sac State is the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. It's one of the largest and most important public health surveys in the country. It's funded through the CDC, so we collect the California portion of that. And so that's about 10,000 respondents per year, every year. And so what we started doing was asking at the very end of that survey, and this is a caddy, right? This is a traditional caddy survey. And so we started asking at the end of that survey, everybody who had completed it, would you be willing or interested in completing more surveys in the future online, right? And so if people said yes, then we asked them for their email address and we marked that down. And over the course of about a year, we collected about 3,500 email addresses that way, to whom we then went back, recontacted, and said, hey, okay, now's the time. You want to go ahead and join our panel. And part of the problem with that is that we started collecting those email addresses long before we were ready to actually get going on the panel. And so in some cases, there was almost a year in between the time that we collected the email address and we contacted them again. In other cases, it was literally a few days, but in some cases it was a year. So that was a long time between the time we got the address and we recontacted. The second sampling method, we used Qualtrics. So they are our panel provider, as is the case with many academic institutions. They're probably the industry leader in terms of online survey data collection. They've got an extremely user-friendly interface that facilitates creating surveys and distributing them online really, really well. And so one of the things that we use them to help us with then is collecting panelists, right? And so they have existing panels that they have collected basically through, until I got into all this, I didn't realize that I guess every time that we click on one of those, click OK or agree on one of those user agreements online, every time we, download a song through iTunes, or anytime we basically do anything online and that agreement pops up and it's 500 pages and you don't read it and you click OK, what you may not realize is that by clicking OK, you're authorizing that company to then give your email address to whoever wants it. And so those email addresses get amassed in giant data science files, and Qualtrics and other companies like them then access those email addresses and recruit people to be in their panels, right? And so they have gigantic, hundreds of thousands of panelists that they've amassed, and so we use them to sample from within their panel for us using a quota sampling technique where we looked at the American Community Survey of 2014 and identified the basic demographic parameters in California with regard to gender, race, ethnicity, education, income, etc. And then we also looked at party registration to see what the breakdown is in terms of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. Collectively provided Qualtrics with those quotas so they could create a subsample of panelists for us that would basically meet those quotas. And we all know the challenges and problems that are associated with quota sampling as opposed to random probability sampling, but hey, it's better than just sort of putting an ad up on Facebook and seeing who you get. Or at least that's what we're assuming, it's better than that. And so Qualtrics, when they recruited, they provided a $1 incentive to their people to join our panel. And the other way, right, the BRFSS survey that we got the emails and then contacted them, we didn't give them anything, okay? One of the other things about this was it was incredibly fast. So from the time that we told Qualtrics that we wanted them to do this, within 3 days they had 1,000 respondents for us, or 1,000 agreed panelists, who not only had agreed, but had taken a profile survey that provided all of their demographic information as well as about 25 other, no more than that, about 30 other questions that we asked with regard to all kinds of politics questions, public health questions, a personality profile that we then have on these people, so that in the future, every time we distribute a survey for them to respond to, we don't have to ask any of those questions. We already know it. The third sampling method, which is still ongoing, and this is actually the one that we, in the long run, want to go to if it works, right? And we'll have yet to find out the degree to which it's going to work, is address-based sampling. And so this is what people are going to now, as many of you probably know, instead of the random digit dialing method, because you do have, the post office does have a comprehensive list of residences throughout California and indeed throughout the country with about 99% coverage. And so we worked with another one of our partners, Marketing Systems Group, to purchase a random sample, a stratified random sample of Californians that we broke down into clusters according to different counties and clustered certain counties together and then said, okay, for this sampling plan we're purchasing from you guys, we want 22% to come from the LA area, 21% to come from the Bay Area, et cetera, et cetera. So matching the population rates. Another thing that's nice about Marketing Systems Group and these samples that they can provide from the post office file is that they're able to match names to about 90% of them. So then when we send our postcards to people, which is what I'm getting to, the postcard actually has a name on it, which we're hoping is going to improve our response rate. Anyway, so we send out a postcard invitation saying, hey, you know, the Cal Speaks panel, blah, blah, blah. It's great, you should join, you can make a difference, right? You can help, your voice counts, and you can improve policy making in California, make it more responsive, and yada, yada, yada. If you're interested, right, we give them a link that we made a nice tiny little short link, right, you know, because you know, URLs are long and unwieldy. We use tiny URL online to convert the link to something that just says Cal Speaks, basically. So they just type that in, and they can go and they can start taking those profile surveys and join the panel, like I mentioned. And so this is the thing that really most approximates probability-based sampling, because in the same way that you would random digit dial from a comprehensive list of phone numbers or landlines like we used to, you have a comprehensive list of residences that you're randomly sending postcards to and seeing who responds, in the same way that you see who answers the phone and responds to your dialing. So like I said, this is what we want to work. So comparing the methods in terms of cost. As I said a minute ago, when we gathered email addresses at the tail end of the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, a big advantage to that is it's free. Right? It didn't cost us a dime. Qualtrics cost us about $14,000 for them to recruit those folks for us. And then the overall costs of purchasing the sampling frame of residences and names from Marketing Systems Group, and then the costs of working with our university printer to print the postcards, and then mail 25,000 postcards, because we're mailing 25,000 postcards with the hope of getting about 800 respondents, right, or panelists at the end of the day. Because we can't actually afford to send a pre-postcard, hey, this is coming, and then the postcard, and then a follow-up, and like all that stuff that you would like to do. We can't afford to do that. It costs us $50,000, right? But so we sent it once. Overall, the cost was about $9,200, and so less expensive than Qualtrics, but more expensive than free. So, what about, you can't read this, but it says comparing the methods now in terms of response rate. So our Burfus collection, again, the email addresses that we got, and then the long time, the gap of time in between when we gathered those and contacted, we wound up getting a response rate in terms of converted panelists of 9%, 9.2 or something like that. And so they did get 2 reminders, right? They were invited to join, and then a few days later they got a second invitation, and a few days later they got a third invitation. It took the average person who did ultimately respond about 5 days to do so, to join. And it took almost 2 contacts, right? The mean is about 1.7. So Qualtrics, here we got a 23% response rate. So that's calculated by the number of invitations that Qualtrics sent to their existing panelists, right? Versus the number of people who ultimately joined our panel. So almost a quarter of them joined, which is obviously much better. But you would expect that, because these are people who have actually already agreed to participate in panels, period. And they got $1, right, for doing so, whereas nobody else did. And like I said, this happened very, very fast. They did get a couple of reminders, but again, it was day after day, and about 40% of the people who did joined just on the first day. So the final group, or the final method, which, like I said, is the one that we want, it's unclear what the response rate is, because those postcards are literally in their mailboxes right now. They were sent on Wednesday, and so they should be arriving across the state probably yesterday, and we're hoping that by Monday we'll have at least a few people who've joined. So the third, or I'm sorry, comparing the methods in terms of, in terms of the response rate to the first real survey. And so I just said that at the point in time that people decide to participate in the panel, they immediately get filtered into a profile survey that I mentioned, where they fill out all this stuff. but that's not one of our real CalSpeak surveys, right? So the first real survey that we have distributed to people is a survey with regard to perceptions and attitudes as they pertain to higher education. So we want to understand the degree to which people understand differences between CSUs, differences between CSUs and UCs, how they feel about impaction, how they feel about rising costs, what they think that state policymakers or higher education administrators should do about those rising costs, yada, yada, yada. And so that was our first real survey. So this is telling us the percentage of people that had joined the panel, and then what percentage of them actually wound up completing the first survey that we sent to them a few weeks later. And so the Burfus panel collection got a lower response rate. Only about 35% of people who had joined the panel then participated in this real survey. Qualtrics almost, 4/5 of them did. So that was one nice thing. And as I said, it's unclear with the third method. Okay, so what about representativeness? So here we just have a few things. There are of course lots of other categories that we could look at to gauge representativeness. These are just some basic gender and race and age and education and political ones. So just glancing at this, comparing the Burfus sample collection or the sampling methodology to the Qualtrics one, we can see that both overrepresent women, which is quite common in any online data collection, and actually quite common in any survey data collection, right? Because that's true of phone surveys as well.
So that first line is actually female?
Huh?
That first line is actually female, even though all we can
Oh
see
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
male?
Sorry about that.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
yeah. It's supposed to be female, so we're saying, relative to the American Community Survey, to what degree do each of these methods overrepresent or underrepresent those folks, right? And so you can see that both groups overrepresent women. Qualtrics a little bit worse than Burfus, but that difference between the +9 and +12 is probably not statistically significant. I didn't test it, but I doubt it is. As you can see, they actually nailed the African American population about right. Those differences from 0 are definitely not statistically significant. The big thing is they radically underrepresent Latinos, which is another thing that is quite common for all surveys, right? It's difficult, especially those that are conducted primarily in English. We give people the option to participate in Spanish, but it's a challenge to get Latino men, women in California to respond in a representative way to surveys, and this is even more the case. Having said that, again, the 19 versus 16 is probably about the same, so one version versus the other doesn't really do better in that regard. It would appear that the Qualtrics method basically got Asian Americans right. They didn't underrepresent those as much as the Burfus method. And as you can see, they pretty much got age right in terms of overrepresenting elderly, or retired age Americans. It is again quite common for surveys of all stripes before waiting to overrepresent older Americans. This is no different, but really Qualtrics got it pretty close, whereas the Burfus methodology really missed it by a large margin there. And then the other thing that you expect is to get more participation by people of higher education than the general population. And that indeed is what you see. So both methods significantly overrepresent the percentage of people who have high school educations, with both, basically almost 100% of the people that we gathered from the Burfus methodology had a high school education at least. With the Qualtrics sampling methodology, it was around 93 or something like that, if I remember correctly, whereas the California numbers are more like 87, if I remember that correctly, or maybe 82. Anyway, you get the general idea. Ditto with regard to college grads, although Qualtrics really didn't miss it by very much. The Burfus methodology, really, that's the worst one, right? You see people with college educations are overrepresented by 28 percentage points. Right, so that's shocking, or it's pretty bad. One thing that was surprising, though, a little bit, and interesting for people who are interested in politics, is that even though you get some misrepresentation or over/underrepresentation on these demographic categories, they really nailed it with regard to party ID, with regard to registered Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. As you can see, the Qualtrics method actually nailed it perfectly, and Burgess only missed by 5 points. So, in general, both of these sampling methodologies overrepresent women, older Californians, Californians with higher socioeconomic status, and non-Hispanic whites, which, again, you know, I'm not exactly sure what the relevant comparison group is now, right? If we're trying to say, hey, are these methods representative of the California population without weighting, then the answer is no. But is it, if the question is, is this methodology or these methodologies less representative than what you get from phone surveys? I'm not really sure about that because, as again, as I mentioned before, increasingly, in our experience anyway, with the surveys that we do, we observe these same overrepresentations in the phone and the CADI data collections that we complete. So, in terms of comparing the methods, the Qualtrics quota sampling method was a little bit more representative and way more efficient. I remember we said that the response rates were much better, much faster, but also a lot more expensive. So, if you have any questions, I'm here, and you could also contact me if you're interested in learning more about the CalSpeaks panel at davidbarker@cscos.edu. Thanks. Who's next? Well, I can trade places with you if you want to.
Okay, or would you prefer to be over here, Randy? I'll probably stand down. Okay.
Here, I'll just give you this if you want.
Okay, sit down for a second.
Okay.
So, Ernie twisted my arm to be in this panel. You see the result of my feeble effort to resist. Really hard. So, I want to talk a little bit today about the International Social Survey Program. The intention here is to give people some ideas about research possibilities, and in specific, I want to talk about the work orientation module that is currently in the field. Let's see, which button do I want to hit? This thing.
The arrow to the
arrow.
right.
Okay. So, right now, the International Social Survey Program is in the field collecting data in 49 different countries. And the questions that are being fielded this year are about work and not work, unemployment. And this is the 4th time they've done this work orientation module survey, so there is some opportunity to assess change over time. However, it's not a complete replication, and the data will be available to researchers by 2017. The U.S. participant in the International Social Survey is the General Social Survey. And similar surveys in just about all the nations you would suspect, the G20, but they also, interestingly, include a lot of what the world systems people call the periphery nations in Africa and other places, so you can do some very interesting international comparisons, because apparently sociology extends beyond the U.S. borders. So here's my not so fine print disclaimer. I'm not associated with the ISSP. I don't represent them. I just simply am interested in work issues. And any errors or misstatements are my responsibility and not the ISSP. And my goal was to assist others in planning their research, because I was interested in what they were doing, so I spent some time trying to figure it out. And I thought, well, okay, it won't take me that much longer to make a PowerPoint, so I can share this with others and save them a little legwork. So the last time they did it was in 2005, and now the 2015 module They're using many of the important theoretical questions about work and work outcomes. The most substantial change is they've eliminated questions about employment arrangements, but they've added a bunch of new questions about work experience and attitudes of the unemployed. This was particularly interesting to researchers in Europe because apparently they have a lot of unemployed folks there. And so they've also added questions to measure perceptions of discrimination, both in hiring and employment, and harassment in the workplace. So here's a quick summary of the changes by subtopic. Now, the basis for a lot of research on work has to do with the relationship between intrinsic rewards and extrinsic rewards. And they've kept all of those so you can do change over time, and you can also then within 2015 comparisons between countries. But they've also added a question about the importance of personal contact with others. And so this is one of those questions that might be sort of interesting to people who have a larger interest in like in work alienation, that kind of stuff. Now the work-life balance stuff in the last wave generated a lot of research, particularly for women, increasing numbers of women in the workforce, and how you balance all that. And increasingly, and Dave can probably talk about this for about an hour, is the work-life balance for men as well. When you have children and couples are doing more sharing of the child care responsibilities, and that creates a new work dynamic. So they've kept a lot of questions about the conflicts between work and family, and also the difficulty of taking time off during working hours, which is an important thing if you've got to take kids to the doctor or pick them up or whatever. But they have also dropped some important questions about time allocation and questions about the preferred working environment. And the new questions here is whether they would give up a job to benefit their family, which is an interesting conundrum, and whether they'd remain in a job that wasn't satisfying to benefit their family. Now we can look at changes over time in the US, right, with the importance of the implementation of Obamacare, and a lot of parents stayed in jobs because they had kids with pre-existing conditions and they couldn't change their health insurance. Well, that's all out the window now, so we might start seeing some changes on that score that are related to public policy. The questions on solidarity and conflict, if you're interested in union-related matters, have been maintained. Solidarity and conflict between management and workers, and also conflict and solidarity within the working class or among workers. Now, they've rewritten questions about evaluating unions, which makes it difficult to change, compare over time, but again, we can have the cross-national comparisons. I think this says job characteristics and subjective job experience. All of the job characteristic questions were maintained, but they dropped questions about exhaustion and danger, how exhausted people are in their work and how much danger they face. So, I guess they just had to make some hard choices because you can't have every question you want on a survey, limited resources. So that was one apparently they decided that they would drop in favor of some of the newer questions. This heading says worker flexibility and human capital. They retained questions about changes survey respondents would accept to avoid unemployment, changes in the workplace, and questions about the utilization of current skills, because when people get laid off, a lot of times they get jobs that don't utilize their skill set. They just take whatever they can get. And so that's a question that's important if you want to assess underemployment, I think is the term they use sometimes.
Yeah.
And participation in training to obtain new job skills, that also would be of interest, I suppose, to educators. And a question about the subjective evaluation of the joint value of skill and experience in obtaining a new job has been dropped. So the outcome of work, they've kept questions about job satisfaction, about identification with the firm, which is apparently important to economists, and a willingness to work harder, pride in the firm, and loyalty to the firm. So these are sort of organizational research kinds of questions that are still maintained, so you can do change over time and also comparison between countries. The new questions about the unemployed is 3 questions about the difficulty about obtaining a new job for those currently employed, and 13 questions about unemployment, length of unemployment, reason you got laid off or fired, whether they're currently looking for work. This has to do with like discouraged workers. Subjective questions about the likelihood of finding a job, and then a series of questions on the strategies to use employment. And the main thing they've added now is whether people are using the internet. That was not in the previous survey. questions about job discrimination on the job and during the application process for pay increase and promotion. Anyone's interested in gender or race-related issues these would be questions that might be of interest to you. And also discrimination on the basis of these different characteristics, age, physical characteristics, race, ethnicity, political beliefs, religion, gender, and disability. Uh-oh. Yeah. So, here are some links to the documents if you want to follow up a little bit. The data is distributed free to anybody at gesis.org. You don't have to write these down, there's a happy ending to this. A new work module is available, the questionnaire is available at my website. I have the US version of it. And then for anyone who's interested in contacting the researchers in other nations, maybe to collaborate or find out more about a particular nation, there's a list of the representatives. As I said, this is part of the GSS, and what they distribute is a sort of a slimmed down version of the survey that contains the work module questions and some demographic background. But if you want the more extensive complete national survey, you'll have to get a hold of somebody in that nation, and they'll probably collaborate with you on it. And so this is one entree to getting that if you want the larger, their quote-unquote general social survey for that nation, is the work module is part of. Here's what I did to find out about the modules. I just Googled ISSP work orientation. You can see that several things come back, including the link to the work orientations page at the GESIS where they distribute the data, and a page for the previous module, and then there's the link to the archive and data. Now, here's my page. If you want to write something down, you can write this down, webpages.csus.edu with a little squiggle and an R. It's RMAC, RMAC. And those documents that I just described are available either through links or actually PDFs on my webpage. So you can go to one-stop shopping here to get you into the stream on that. This is what my page looks like, so you know if you get to the right place, or if someone has hijacked my page and put porno links on it, then that'll be fine. All right, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Here's your sheet. Okay.
How do we get that to you? There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, well, before I get started, let me just mention that Ernie and I retired within, I don't know, 5 or 6 months of each other. And to kill some empty time for the first couple years, we wrote a book on an introduction to survey research. So I brought a couple copies. I'm going to pass those around, although I would like them back. My presentation is really based on the first chapter in there. I called it What People Tell Us, What People Do. And this is heavily influenced by a book that Erwin Deutscher wrote a long time ago, 1973, called What We Say, What We Do. Research methodology, quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis can be incredibly complex, but in a lot of ways it's incredibly simple because it's based on some very simple ideas. One being, all research starts with a research question. You don't have a research question, you've got nothing to do research on. For example, why do some high school students go on to college? Why do others not? Why do people vote the way they do? Why do people approve of same-sex marriage and others disapprove? So then the next obvious question is, how do you answer those questions? And if you're a scientist, if you're going to use a scientific approach, the answer is pretty easy. It's empirical. It's with data. Now, Deutscher in his book said there are basically three ways we obtain data. We observe it, we ask questions and listen to what people tell us, or we view the records that people leave behind. For example, Thomas and Seniecki's classic book on the Polish peasant is based in part on diaries. Census records are available to us, so there's just a whole lot of available data out there. Another book that heavily influenced me was a book by Matilda White Riley, written even farther long ago, Sociological Research, A Case Approach. And she laid out 12 decisions that a researcher has to make in deciding how they're going to go about answering their questions. And the same point that Deutscher was making, you either observe or you ask people questions, or you use some form of, she called it, available data. Now, she made a very important point. A lot of this is sort of obvious as we say it, but we lose sight of it. That when we ask people questions, we're getting information about their attitudes, their opinions, beliefs, how they feel about things. And when we observe, we're getting information about behavior and interaction. We're getting very different types of data. Now, we make inferences from one to the other, and that's why this is taken from the book. That's why you have the arrow going both ways. Let me give you some examples. How many of you are familiar with the book Tally's Corner? Okay, good. I suspect that the older we are, the more likely we are to be familiar with it, because that was written a while back. This was a participant observational study. LeBeau spent about a year hanging around with a group of black street corner men in Washington, D.C. in the early 60s. And so he says in the book, men and women talk of themselves and others as cynical, self-serving marauders, ceaselessly exploiting one another as use objects or objects of income. Well, so that's telling us about what people said. This is what they told him. What he observed was that in practice, in their real relationships with real women, the men frequently give the lie to their own words. This is based on what he observed, what he saw. And so he says, well, how do you explain that? Well, he said there are two opposing impulses. The impulse to use women as objects of economic or sexual exploitation, and the desire to build personal, intimate relationships based on mutual liking and love. So he said you've got these two different impulses operating, and they aren't really contradictions. They're just telling us different things about these men. What they told LeBeau and what he observed. Well, going back to Deutscher, Deutscher reports on a study even earlier in the 1930s. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is a fairly well-known study. Richard LaPierre traveled across the U.S. with a Chinese couple. And they ate together in restaurants, they stayed at hotels, auto camps, and he reports that they will only refuse service once in that whole summer of travels. Now, this was during a time in which there was intense prejudice and discrimination against Chinese. And if you don't believe that, just go back and look at the immigration laws that were passed early in the century, restricting immigration and deportation of Chinese immigrants. So 6 months later, LaPierre, so this is one of the real early empirical study, sent questionnaires to these same establishments. And he asked them, will you accept members of the Chinese race as guests in your establishment? And what he found was that approximately 90% said no. Okay, so he was refused service they were refused service once, and 90% of the people are saying no, we won't provide service to Chinese. They were emphatic, they will not serve Chinese, but in fact they did. What's going on there? Well, you get the difference between what people told him and what he observed. You're getting different types of data. Now, they're not always inconsistent. If you know any of the work of Howard Schuman, a University of Michigan survey researcher, he's done incredible work in the area of survey research, and I would really suggest you look at his book Method and Meaning in Polls and Surveys that he published in 2008, because he's basically summarizing his life's work in that book. And he reports on a study that he and Robert Brannon did in 1969. He has a nice way to phrase this. He calls it an attitude behavior field study. Well, attitudes, what people tell you; behavior, what you observe. And in the survey, respondents were asked their opinion of open housing laws. So here's the question. Suppose there's a community-wide vote on the general housing issue. There are two possible laws to vote on. Which law would you vote for? One law says that a homeowner can decide for himself who to sell his house to, or even if he prefers not to sell to blacks. 82% selected that. And the second law says that a homeowner cannot refuse to sell to someone because of their race or color. 16%. What people tell you. So 3 months after the survey, the same respondents were asked to sign a petition. One of the petitions supported the first law. The second petition supported the second law. And they were randomly assigned petitions. So what he found was that if you look at the people who were opposed to open housing, which remember is the 82%, about 85% were consistent in signing the open rights petition. People who were supporting the open housing law, they were willing to sign the owner's rights. No, I'm sorry, the other way around. People who opposed the open housing law were willing to sign the owner's rights petition, but 78% were consistent in refusing to sign the open housing petition, which gave them an overall average of 82% consistency. In other words, he's saying people were pretty consistent in behaving in a way that you would predict based on what they told him. So Schuman concludes that in this study, attitudes can predict behavior to a reasonable extent, though not, of course, perfectly. Another more recent study, Eleanor Singer and her associates studied the impact of privacy and confidentiality concerns, what people told them, on participation in the 2000 census, what people did, behavior. And they found that attitudes towards confidentiality and privacy were significantly related to behavior. So what does all this mean? We're getting different information. And that's, I think, the point that people miss, is that what people tell you is different from what they do, and they're giving you different pieces of information, and so why be surprised that sometimes they're consistent and sometimes they aren't. They're different types of data. Well, that suggests that using data from different sources would be advantageous, because all data suffers from different types of error. It's one of the points that we made in the book, is that all data suffer from certain types of error, but not the same types of error. So it follows then that using data from different sources, different methods of collection, would be highly advantageous. Those of you that are older probably are familiar with William Foote White's Street Corner Society. Again, a classic participant observational study. Now, he did another study that is not that well known, community conflict and cooperation in Andean communities. And it was a study of 12 communities in Peru. And what was nice about this study is that they had graduate students acting as participant, not participant, observers in these different communities who wrote up their ethnographic notes. And then they had two surveys, one